If you want some optimism, this is not a video for you. It's a terrifying warning. It's the opposite of optimism.
At the point we're at right now, it seems more dangerous in the West war against Russia than it has been ever. Can you describe where you think we are and where this is going?
Yeah, let me do it through the tool, Tucker, of the article I wrote on the coming war with Russia. And the reason I wrote it was I was hearing a lot of people here saying we're getting ready for war with Russia. We'll be ready to fight in 2030.
A lot of the big leaders of Europe are saying that war against Russia by 2030.
I don't think that's true because we can't afford to be. But anyway, that's the narrative that's being sold to the European publics. And the problem is that, of course, the Russians will be listening to this. Of course, they'll be listening to it. So I thought it would be a good idea to say, well, okay, well, if we're going to be ready to fight a war with Russia, what's it going to be like? And the first thing about the article was I said that let's not assume that Russia is going to wait doing nothing until 2030 until we're ready. So let's assume that because of the way that we're starting to promote attacks deep into Russia by the E3, that's Germany, Britain and France, providing weapons, and weapons with significant warheads as well, 250 kilograms and significant.
It's weapons from Europe, guided by U.S. intelligence, U.S. satellites, U.S. Starlink. Ukraine's only role is as a launching platform. Europe is practically already at war with Russia.
Range deep into Russia. Let's not assume that the Russians are just going to sit back and let this happen. So my starting point was to say, okay, well, let's assume that Russia attacks Europe or attacks certain elements of Europe. And what the Russians have
a high chance of this actually happening this year. Not guaranteed, but high.
Said that they have not taken these attacks off the agenda, which is a warning, and it's a warning which we seem to be ignoring. So let's assume that the first attacks happen in September of this year. And my scenario, and I should emphasize, it's a scenario, not a forecast. So it's trying to make people think about what could happen. So let's assume these attacks happen.
This is what I think is interesting. We've talked a lot about whether Russia is going to attack Europe, but what would that actually look like? Let's see.
In September of this year, and the Russians destroy with hypersonic missiles the factories that are making drones and missiles in Britain, in France, and in Germany. And the question then is, what does Europe do? And of course, the first thing Europe does is it says, okay, well, we're now going to invoke Article 5. And all of a sudden, people realize what Article 5 really means. I mean, you've got NATO, which, when I was serving in NATO, understanding NATO Force Mediterranean, we used to say that NATO stood for no ability to organize. I mean, it's slightly unfair.
A little bit of exaggeration, but it's partly true in some cases.
But actually, NATO isn't this great omnipotent coalition. People say it's the strongest coalition since in history. I mean, that obviously isn't true. The strongest coalition in history, as far as I can see, was the Allied coalition in the Second War with the United States, Britain, the Commonwealth, Russia, and China. That's the strongest coalition by far. So NATO invokes Article 5, and the three countries that have been attacked invoke Article 5, and they realise that suddenly that actually what Article 5 means is that an attack on one is an attack on all, but it doesn't mean that actually those...
Just because you're attacked doesn't necessarily mean you have to go to war, especially if it's not your citizens that died, not your country that got damaged.
The whole of the NATO forces have to respond, and people decide to respond as they think best. And in the article, I propose that Hungary says, no, we're not getting engaged. Spain says, no, we're not getting engaged. We don't think this is in our interests. I think other countries might equivocate. It's difficult to say, but, countries like Hungary, for example, obviously won't. So at that stage, we suddenly see that this isn't all it means. But the big issue, Tucker, is what does the United States do? Now, of course, we know that Rubio has been looking at...
Trump won't send troops to fight Russia because of Article 5. That's my prediction. He might send aircraft carriers, he'll send bombs, he'll send ships, he'll maybe blockade Russia or something of that nature, but he won't send physical troops on the ground to fight Russia. I mean, so far, he hasn't even been willing to send troops on the ground to fight Iran. How in the world would he be willing to fight Russia, which is far tougher than Iran?
As if the United States is shifting back in to support these operations. But at that moment, I think there's an open question about what the United States do if it sees attacks into Russia, especially if those have been warned. that the attacks have warned, we've made no response to them. And my guess is that the Americans will not want to commit troops into mainland Europe to fight a war against Russia on European soil, and for US troops to fight and die on European soils. I wouldn't if I were in the United States. So you're then in the situation, well, now what do the Europeans do? And again, just to develop the scenario, I assume the Europeans do the only thing they can do, because their land forces are not ready, is that they use air forces to respond to Russia, and that doesn't go very well. That actually they find that they're up against Russia, which has got a lot of experience in air defense. In one of my jobs in the Navy was to be the captain of air.
Three nations with the best air defense are Russia. Actually, Russia and China, I should just say. United States, our air defense, yeah, well, okay, I'll put it up in the big three, but on mainland United States, our air defense isn't that great because no one ever attacks the United States. On our bases around the world, we actually do have some decent air defenses when we have the missiles, when we're not short of the interceptors.
Air defense destroyer, and I was what was known as the anti-air warfare commander, and I can tell you that we are in poor shape in Europe in terms of being able to defend our skies. We would struggle to respond to saturation drone attacks. We've got extremely limited responses to conventional ballistic missiles. I'm a great fan of Ted Postal, who's an MIT professor on this. He thinks that the Patriot PAC-3 systems are possibly looking about 3% effectiveness. And when it comes to hypersonic missiles, we've got no response whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, I don't think any nation has a great air defense against hypersonic missiles, especially the ones that can maneuver. Russia has stuff they can use, but it's not guaranteed. Hypersonics that can maneuver are the most difficult thing to shoot down.
So suddenly we're making attacks that aren't very successful. But in return, I say that because the E3 have decided to respond to Russia's attacks, that they then take the gloves off and use hypersonic missiles, probably with conventional missiles, to do more damage. And the thing that I would go after, especially as an energy expert, would be to do the same thing that they've done in Kiev and in Ukraine, which is to surgically start to undermine our energy infrastructure. And I can tell you that
after all the attacks on refineries that Europe has done using Ukraine as a launching platform, yes, Russia is going to use Oreshniks on refineries and do a lot of payback.
Missile landing in a liquid natural gas terminal or an oil terminal in Milford Haven or Rotterdam would do extensive damage. That would be bad enough, but unfortunately, of course, because of the sanctions we placed on Russia in the first place about 4 years ago, we've switched ourselves off from Russian oil, switched ourselves off from Russian gas. So that's 40% of our gas.
What's unfortunate isn't that they switched themselves off cheap energy from Russia. It's the deindustrialization that caused. Because you need an industrial base to make weapons of war. And if you deindustrialize, like the United States has done and how Europe has done since they cut themselves off from Russian energy, you can't make missiles, planes, or anything in great volumes or at great speed, especially when you need rare earths from China.
Gas. We've also, of the particular products, we've switched ourselves off to Russian diesel, who used to provide us with 40% of Europe's diesel. Now, as an energy expert, if you can explain to me how you can run a modern industrial society without diesel, then I'm all ears, but I don't know how to do it. Diesel is critical for farming, for fishing, for food logistics.
Yeah, the energy shortage is going to hurt Europe much worse than the United States, especially next winter in terms of natural gas.
Construction for running the other two primary energy sources, that's renewable energy and nuclear energy. I could go on and on. It really is the critical fuel, and we've switched ourselves off to it. And of course, having switched ourselves off and increased our prices in Europe, which of course is having an effect on our economies, especially Germany's economy, we're now in the situation where the Strait of Hormuz is closed. And so we've got a second wham on top of the first wham. So talk about being in a very, very fragile position. It's an extremely weak position, not least of all because we import about 12 million barrels a day into oil into the European region. Norway is reasonably self-sufficient. In fact, Norway is completely self-sufficient. And we get about 45% or so of our...
Norway is going to do well, or relatively to the rest of the EU, during the oil shortage, because they actually produce oil.
hydrocarbons from the North Sea, although that's reducing. But Europe generally is extremely vulnerable. So what you've got is a situation which is that our energy infrastructure is being written down at a time when we have no chance of defending our skies against it. And again, this is why I was trying to actually make the point to people who are prepared to think about this, what this war might look like, because the economic consequences of this would be profound.
Russia has no desire to actually conquer Western Europe. It might have some interest in the Baltic states that have big ethnic Russian populations, but beyond that, it does not want to control the land here. What it does want to do is it wants to degrade their ability to make, for example, drones that can be used to shoot Russia. So you destroy those drone factories, you destroy the energy infrastructure in Germany, France, UK, so they don't have power. If you don't have power, you can't build anything. And Russia's happy at that point. It doesn't need to conquer anything. It just needs to deep weaponize Europe so that they're not making drones to be sent deep into Russia.
Mathematically, there's a really close relationship between the use of energy and GDP. It's extremely close. It's close to 1. It's about sort of 0.99 or something.
Yes.
So what that means is when you take energy out of the system, then you are going to have a consequent effect which is similar in rough order of magnitude on your economy. So if we take 10% of the world's energy away, then surprise, surprise, don't be surprised if we get...
Yeah, there are a bunch of pussies in the EU, but they're a bunch of warmongering pussies, especially the ones in charge. They're talking about war with Russia, they're provoking Russia, and it's a very bad combination, frankly.
It's a global reduction in GDP of 10%. That's getting close to a depression. Indeed, it's on the borderline of depression. But going back to Europe, it wouldn't surprise me at all if we're in a situation where, were such an attack to happen, then we would be in deep economic trouble. And I think that would lead to deep political trouble as well. But again, it is a scenario, and the point of the scenario was to help people really think about what such a war might mean, and really make sure that we've done the risk assessment.
Lots of reasons to be strong.
I think the people in France, Germany, UK, are, for example, already very fed up with the establishment, and if that establishment gets them into a war with Russia and has a Russian raining down over Europe, yeah, that anger is going to boil over, and the establishment will absolutely be voted out of power at the next election, which some of them are, in some cases, pretty soon. Anyway, this was an interesting video on what it would look like if Russia attacked Europe, and it doesn't look good for Europe. This will be on YouTube. Like and subscribe. Come watch on Kiko Twitch, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.